Speaking of Courage podcast, back in the studio.
Back again.
What's up, man?
Not a whole lot, man.
What's been going on with you?
Nothing. Finally got hot enough. I didn't wear my button-up shirt on here, though.
And then I wore mine.
I went back to a T-shirt. Hey,
Yeah.
you got the short sleeve. You're
Yeah.
still sponsored by Dixon, though.
Yep. I took the hat off, though.
Yeah. Changing it up a little bit.
So what's new?
All right, man. It's been a little while. So
Yeah.
I hopefully coming back with a big one here. This one was requested on the Instagram. I put up a poll, so we're going to actually go. What'd you say it was?
Navy.
So I actually lied to you. This is actually Coast Guard. So
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Damn it.
Close enough,
And
right?
I'm sitting here going, oh, yeah, that was an easy one.
The only difference, I have his sleeve folded up, but the main difference, they have a little Coast Guard shield on their cuff. That's about generally all.
But their uniforms are pretty much the same?
Yeah, usually they're Department of the Navy uniforms and equipment and a lot of that. You know, pretty much real similar culture, rating system, rates, and all that. So
Coast Guard have had many Medal of Honors or no?
This is actually the only Coast Guard Medal of Honor recipient in Coast
American
Guard
history?
service, in American history. The Coast Guard, a lot of people don't realize what the Coast Guard does and what their job is.
Yeah.
The Coast Guard is actually older than the Navy officially. It was founded in 1790, and it's been part of every major conflict the U.S. has ever fought.
How come you don't hear about it?
Because people are just naive and stupid, and people like to, the Coast Guard. But the Coast Guard has a number of missions, right? They have their warfighting mission, but they also do customs. They do border patrol, essentially. They're doing maritime enforcement. They're doing life-saving, drug smuggling, all kinds of stuff.
That's dangerous stuff, too.
Exactly. And one of the ways I always put it when I got out of the Army is I was an infantryman. I was, I did an overseas deployment. I came home, et cetera. When you're in the infantry and you're training, when you're back in the States, if you're not in the field or in the motor pool, you're playing PlayStation or you're hiding from your higher command, right? The Coast Guard is always working. The Coast Guard is always doing their job. So they have a full functional regular mission, right? And then during wartime, they supplement. Sometimes they supplement the Navy. Sometimes they're acting on their own. But this is going to be one of those.
I didn't know that, man.
Yeah, most people don't. During World War II, the Coast Guard actually had 802 cutters, which are the ships that they use. They had more than 49,000 Coast Guards serving on Navy ships and Army vessels, as well as their own Coast Guard vessels. During the war, the Coast Guard sunk 11 enemy submarines, and then they also were responsible for landing the Navy and Marines and every invasion in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific.
Wow.
So these were the guys that were bringing, when you're watching Saving Private Ryan and they're coming up, those are Navy guys, but a lot of the times those are Coast Guard guys.
Bringing the soldiers to the beach?
Exactly. Those Coast Guards are the expert in that small craft patrolling, right?
Oh, the ones that are coming up to
the
beach.
2,000 Coast Guards gave their life in World War II. 2,000 Coast Guardsmen, or Coasties as we sometimes call them, gave their lives during World War II, to give you an idea of the role that they played.
Yeah.
So very, very overlooked part of history. Since 1790, there's only been one Medal of Honor recipient who was a member of the Coast Guard. Should have been more. One more that we're going to be talking about today with this one. There should have been quite a few more, in my opinion. But as it stands, there's only been one. And for the foreseeable future, that's probably a good...
So is this like the god of the Coast Guard?
I don't know that he's the god. My understanding is that every Coast Guardsman or Coastie learns his story when they go to their basic training, and a lot of Marines actually are familiar with his story as well. Yeah. So if he's not super well known, he should be, but I know that he has a special place in the Coast Guard.
What's his name?
So today we're doing Douglas Munro. Douglas Munro. So some of you guys will be familiar with that. And Douglas was actually born in British Columbia in Vancouver, in Canada.
Really?
Yeah, in 1919. So his dad was actually an American who had moved there with his mom and his stepdad, and his mom was actually British. So from a young age, or when he was a young age, they actually moved to the United States. So he spent most of his childhood in Washington, and Cle Elum, I believe it's pronounced. So he was born in Canada, but he grew up as an American kid in Washington there.
So American culture brought up?
Exactly. And his dad was born in Sacramento, California, and like I said, his mom was born in the UK and then brought over to Canada. But he had one of those good lives. He was a little older than some of the other World War II vets. This is going to be that early part of the war. But in his youth, he was kind of an all-around good kid. It's hard to separate legend from fact with some of these people. Yeah. But with Douglas, they said he had a high level of musical aptitude, played percussion, trumpet, harmonica, and he performed in the drum and bugle corps. So he would be playing for the American Legion and for these funerals and for these ceremonies and everything, kind of getting indoctrinated almost into a life of service very early on, and playing taps for those funerals. He's going to kind of understand what the military is, right? And he's raised a real good kid. By all accounts, everyone in the neighborhood said he's just a good kid. So he was going to understand this kind of stuff, and that's going to kind of shape who he was later. This time that he's growing up is going to be, of course, the Great Depression, though, right?
Yeah.
And they're living in Washington, so this is kind of a coastal area where he's at. His dad was an electrician, And his dad actually was able to keep his job. So while a lot of other people were poor and struggling, their family was doing okay. And Douglas had a really close friendship with a guy named Mike Cooley, who was his lifelong best friend as a child. And the two of them took it upon themselves to cut down lumber and bring it to people who didn't have any and try to help these other people during the Depression. So
that's awesome.
He knew that they were doing okay, so he and Mike would go around and try to help other people. So that kind of shows you what kind of person he was. And he and Mike were basically glued to the hip. You know, they were solid best friends, and that's going to be a pattern in Douglas's life. Is he's going to attach to people and he's going to be extremely loyal to them, and it kind of shows you what kind of person he is.
Right.
And those character traits that make you loyal to a friend is going to be the kind of character traits that sometimes lead into something like the
Great Depression couldn't have come at a better time for our country.
Yeah, it was the Forge.
It's just exactly the Forge. It's those tough times breed just really strong, and you had to be unselfish in those times.
Exactly. It separates the wheat from the chaff, right?
And then everybody's equally screwed in our country, and then the military happens, and it's like togetherness, man.
That a lot of the shock that hits you in the military, the lack of food and sleep, people had been living with that for 10 years, and some of them had been living that their entirety, and a lot of their parents their dads had walked away, or they ended up in orphanages because someone died or something.
And then a lot of the guys, like we talked about, growing up in poverty. Now they're in the military. They're getting 3 meals a day. It's probably not so.
They're fortunate for it, right? And they have a sense of obligation. So they're sending some of that money home to their parents, and they're seeing that as a good thing.
Yeah.
So this is going to be one of those cases as well. But he's actually, as opposed to being one of the less fortunate, he's one of the more fortunate, but instead of like Snuffy Smith, who's riding around and flaunting it, he's actually grateful, and he's trying to share with other people and trying to help other people. Just like I said, just a good kid. One of those good lifestyles, though, growing up outdoors, playing on the water, going out swimming on the coast, making the rafts. There's a lot of inlets and waterways in Washington, so doing all that
cool place
stuff.
to grow up.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It's awesome.
I think Oregon's the most beautiful state I've been to, and my buddy from Washington says Oregon is Washington light.
I've been on the my wife's family lives in northern Oregon, but it's right across the Columbia River, and Washington looks pretty amazing.
My wife and I went to Alaska, and it was amazing. And then we came back and went and visited my uncle in Oregon, and we were like, "Wow, I think Oregon has a whole Alaska beat there."
Yeah.
So this is where he's growing up, though. That land of mountains and rivers, and he's a Boy Scout, so he's learning all these things, and he's going to be hanging out with his friends. He was really close with his sister, who was a couple years older. They had a real tight family bond, and in high school he was on the wrestling team, which again shows you what kind of person somebody is. There's actually video of him wrestling, which is really cool. I'll add it onto here. He did tumbling, basketball, and he was a good dancer. So he was
an athlete.
He was an athlete, and he was an all-around affable guy. Real skinny and slim, though. He's got a good smile, but you can just tell he's just one of those guys, And he actually graduated from high school in 1937, so a few years before the war.
Right in the middle of the Depression, though, right?
In the middle of the Depression, exactly. Yeah, we had not started to come out yet, but he's still making the best of everything. After high school, he enrolled in the Central Washington College of Education, and the reason he picked that college is it was close to Clay Elum, where he's from, and he wanted to continue to play in the Sons of the American Legion Drum and Bugle Corps, which again shows his loyalty, right?
Yeah.
This is something he's dedicated himself to, and that he's helping, and that he's grown up with. So he actually picked his college so he could stay close
means something to him,
to his community and to his obligations. While he was in college, he was a Yale King, which is a cheerleader. But my grandpa was actually a Yale King. People think now of male cheerleaders, but that was actually a fairly common thing. I think
not only that, you're surrounded by girls.
Right, exactly. That's kind of the kicker when you're the one guy.
It was funny when people used to make fun of male nurses. Now it's like actually pretty common. Mm-hmm. You want to be around a bunch of single women.
Exactly.
Good place to be.
That's the smartest way to do it. But he's kind of thriving in this college life. But as he's going on, right, as 1937 turns to 38 to 39, black clouds are kind of storming over Europe and the Pacific. The United States doesn't go to war till December 7th, 1941. Japan is already invading multiple countries, right? September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Germany's invading, Czechoslovakia. It's taking over Austria. It's taking Austria
through Europe.
All these other people, just blitzkrieging through Europe. So these storm clouds are on the horizon, and Douglas is a smart guy. He's a college guy, so he's seeing this, and he's watching Europe fall.
Which is crazy. Those are old country. You know what I mean?
Right.
It was probably looked at differently back then. When you thought of Europe, you probably thought advanced and they're falling.
That's the old country.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's kind of the dream. A lot of American expats were in Paris and everything.
Yeah.
In between the wars, a lot of guys, even hillbillies that served in the World War I, had been to these places, and now they're seeing them on the news or they're hearing them on the radio.
Think about it now. you hear a country like that falling.
Right.
It would
So
be like, whoa. I mean,
Russia's
look at
invading
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Now imagine if Russia was invading Paris right
Yeah.
now, right? So you're watching that.
You're
So-
seeing like famous landmarks.
Exactly. So we're not there yet. This is still prior to that, but Douglas is already seeing what's on the horizon. A lot of people are trying to bury their head in the sand, and Douglas is going, "Hey, man, like this is bad. We need to do something about this." So he decides he's actually going to drop out of school and he wants to join the military
Right.
because he feels a strong sense of obligation. Based on his growing up on the coast, though, he wants to join one of the maritime services. So he goes and talks to the Marines, he talks to the Navy, he talks to the Coast Guards. He's going and he's looking at these places, but he ends up deciding on the Coast Guard. And when he asked, his sister asked him why, he said because the Coast Guard's main mission is to save lives, and he wanted to be a part of the solution, essentially. Right?
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to. He wants to serve his country. He wants to do something. He wants to stop this, fascist invasion of these countries. But he also wants to be someone that's saving lives, and he knows that that's what the Coast Guard's goal is. So at 20 years old, he's going to enlist in the United States Coast Guard on September 18th, 1939. He's so small, which is like a lot of these guys.
Common theme.
He actually didn't meet the Coast Guard weight requirement. So the week before he joined, he had to sit around and basically just shove bananas in his mouth and try to eat as much as he could to get his weight up. He needed to gain 6 pounds in 10 days is what they said. So just trying to stuff everything he could. So when he went in, he was actually 5'8", 138 pounds, which is actually bigger than I was by quite a bit.
Yeah.
But Coast Guard has higher standards, apparently. I was 5'9", 123 when I joined the Army. So he's bigger than I was, but it's still kind of a funny how badly you want to get in, especially this peacetime Coast Guard as it was. So before he left, he ended up spending his last night with Mike Cooley, who was his best friend, and Mike would end up serving in the Army in Europe later. Because this war's not going to let anybody go untouched, essentially. So they ended up saying goodbye, and then he went to entrance processing in Seattle. And while he was there, he met the next major character in his life, who was another coastie by the name of Ray Evans. So as he's getting into in-processing, there's another recruit joining named Ray Evans, and these two would end up being lifelong buddies, and they're going to be kind of connected at the hip the way he and Mike had been.
Okay.
So one thing about the Coast Guard, though, was the Coast Guard had not been accepting new recruits for many, many years, right? Because they didn't need anybody. There were guys that were in there 20, 30 years. There's no big war going on. They have their mission.
No movement.
Now they finally opened it up to recruits, and they didn't know what to do with them. So he's going to end up getting sent for recruit training at Air Station Port Angeles. But this isn't basic training, right? There's no drill sergeants there to meet you. There's nothing like that. He gets there with about, a handful of other recruits, and everybody that's there is looking around at him like, I don't know what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
So they spent their training essentially cutting grass, peeling potatoes, and just, doing maintenance on everything, just completely being bored, not knowing what to do, because there was no training program whatsoever. But while they were there, they got word that the USS Spencer, which is a Coast Guard cutter, was coming down, and it needed people to sign on. So he and Ray immediately volunteered, and they ended up getting accepted, and they joined the Treasury-class cutter USCGC Spencer on September 21st, 1939. And this is where their real training was going to be.
Okay.
So Doug and Ray joined the Spencer, and they're going to be, like I said, pretty much inseparable for the rest of their Coast Guard career. When they're on this ship, they ended up sailing to New York, and like I said, that's where their training's actually going to begin. They're going to train as quartermasters. They're going to be in charge of a lot of the survival and rescue equipment, and they're going to be learning.
What do you mean they sail to New York?
So they're on a Coast Guard cutter. They're on the ship. That's their career goal now, right? So
Right.
they're going to be going from Washington or Seattle all the way around Cape of, South America, and then to New York. So
Wow.
while they're doing that, they're learning their job. They're learning their skills, right? They're learning to maintain this equipment. Life at sea is rough, right?
Yeah.
You're not on a vacation. You're manning the crew. So they're going to have very short nights, and nights include watch. And then during the day, you're going to be manning the rigging and manning the equipment and trying to maintain and figure everything out while they're getting to their mission. This is where I said they have videos of him actually wrestling. So him and Ray would spend their days wrestling with each other and wrestling with other crews. There's actually a video, which I'm going to post on here, of him in his shorts wrestling another guy while he's on one of these ships. So they'd be, passing the time just like military members have done throughout history. You starts with talking, then it turns to fighting, then it turns to rolling, and then it turns to whatever else it was going to be. But Douglas quickly finds that he enjoys the Coast Guard, and he's telling people that he's probably going to make this a career. So he takes to it very well, him and Ray, and they end up getting high marks on everything they do. All of his testing, everything says he's very proficient, except for he ends up spending a week in the hospital for pneumonia, which is kind of big at that time. But eventually they arrived in New York in time for the 1939 World's Fair. you ever heard of the World's Fair?
Yeah, yeah.
So they're there for the 1939 World's Fair, which is huge, right? So again, this kid from Washington grew up during the Great Depression. He's getting to see all this stuff. He's getting to see all these wonders of the whole world that are coming there. New technology, all these countries that are putting out what they want to be represented as. He's getting to see that. So that's very cool. But at the same time, he's in New York now. So they're seeing the tensions, right? They're seeing buildings starting to be locked down. They're seeing the clouds of war on the horizon. They're hearing the news of what's going on in Europe, and their mission quickly gets changed from, hey, a peacetime Coast Guard to now we're going to start gearing up for war, right? Their equipment's getting more militaristic. They're getting more and more trained. They're getting more intense with everything
So we started preparing long before.
Exactly. We knew the war was coming. So Roosevelt actually initiated the Neutrality Patrol to track and report on any Axis powers that reached the U.S. or South America and to demonstrate our readiness to stop anybody. So we started doing what was called Lend-Lease as our tensions increased with Germany. We can't fight the Germans. It's kind of like we're doing with Ukraine right now, but we can sell or trade the British equipment and weapons. So they're using American equipment, American guns and everything, right? So that was called Lend-Lease, and they would give us things for it on the backhand. And then these neutrality patrols were largely manned by the Coast Guard, where these Coast Guard cutters were out, and they were just a giant sweeping net, watching for German ships, watching for Japanese activity, watching for anything that might be coming. So it's a very tense time. And it's kind of funny because...
Not without the technology that we love today.
Exactly.
You have to see it, right?
And a lot of your average Americans at home, obviously they know the war clouds are on the horizon, but it's completely otherworldly to them. But Douglas and Ray and these other guys, they're out there.
Tip of the spear,
exactly.
Yeah. Interesting, man. That had to be an interesting time.
And this is where the Coast Guard comes to their own as well, because our government and the military quickly found that these Navy ships were ill-suited to be doing these missions, right? These smaller Coast Guard crafts that were manned by these coasties that have been doing this for years because they patrol the coastline are better suited for this mission. So the Coast Guard ends up doing a large portion of this, right? They're pulling their weight immeasurably on this. And Douglas and Ray, they were going to be part of these winter patrols where they're up in the North Atlantic going back and forth, where it would get so cold that the air was below freezing. So you'd have to stay below deck, and that cold water would splash on the deck, and it would freeze, and all the rigging and freeze on the lines. And they'd have to come up there with bats and axes and try to beat the ice off so it wouldn't get too heavy on these ships and everything, you know.
Wow.
And then you'd have to rotate back. You could only do 5 to 10 minutes up above the deck, or you could essentially freeze and losing fingers.
This is the shit you don't think about.
Exactly. Using bats and steel bars to break ice off. And they're still doing maritime security and safety as well, right? So they're still, if a small craft sinks somewhere, they're going to still be going and rescuing these people. So that's that. I don't want to say dual mission of the Coast Guard because they have, I think, 7 major missions, but that's their multifaceted aspect of the Coast Guard.
Yeah.
They can go from their militaristic operations to immediately saving stranded boaters or whatever that may be. So they're doing
like Americans, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're still doing those duties.
Exactly. They don't abandon their post for that. They're still doing all of that too. And the Coast Guard's very, very, very tiny at this point.
Yeah.
So in May of 1940, Hitler ends up going to war with France and England after the invasion of Poland and the Europe. All these countries start declaring war on everybody, right? So it becomes vital to supply England and the North Atlantic, to keep it open, to supply them food, material, and munitions. So the war is just creeping closer and creeping closer. If you're a kid in Tennessee, you might not see it, but if you're a coastie out at sea, you're going to be seeing it, right? These cutters that you've been on are going to get more and more armament. They're going to get more and more guns. You're going to start hearing more reports. You're going to take those submarine patrols more seriously. And they're going to end up completing 3 neutrality patrols during this time, Douglas and the Spencer and all these. After that, they end up doing what was called ocean station duty, which are these super isolated patrols. They're way out in the middle of nowhere in the ocean, and they're helping with weather balloons and everything like that. During this time, Douglas and Ray volunteered to become signalmen, which is this rating right here, which is the semaphores with the flags and the signal lights, and that's going to become important in Douglas's future as well. Shows you what kind of person he is, right? They're taking this upon themselves. They don't have to do this, but they end up getting books and studying while they're on the ship, while they're out in the middle of sea, doing their other duties. They're studying as much as they can so they can become signalmen, and eventually they graduate and they earn that rating. They end up becoming signalmen. He gets a short leave to go home for his sister's wedding, and again, when he comes back, his ship has now been re-outfitted. Now it has new sonar, new depth charges, new all these things, right? Now we're not getting new equipment to save stranded boaters. We're getting new equipment to fight. So that war is creeping closer and closer and closer. And then in May 27th of 1941, President Roosevelt declared an unlimited national emergency. Germany and Japan continued to invade, and the United States froze German and Japanese assets in the whole United States, right? So now there's no going back from this point. And this is May of 1941. Navy production increased 70%, and a peacetime draft was initiated. So that's huge, right? First peacetime draft. That means we're not saying we're at war, but hey, you need to start
This is before Pearl Harbor and everything.
Correct. This is May of 1941. We've essentially said, Germany and Japan, you're our enemy. We're not going to fight you right now, but you're persona non grata. We're cutting you off. We're stopping. So on their side, they're fighting wars and they need this equipment. So they're looking at us like the enemy as well, right? In mid-1941, with these tensions on the rise, government emergency mobilization, they actually transferred the Coast Guard from the Department of the Treasury to the Department of the Navy. So now they're under the Navy. So even though they're wearing their Coast Guard shields, they're going to be serving on Navy ships. They're going to be at the Navy's direction, essentially. Yeah. So Munro and Evans got tired of the North Atlantic, and they volunteered for reassignment to the USS Hunter Liggett, which was actually a U.S. Navy ship, which was commanded by a Coast Guard captain, which is something kind of unique, right? A Navy ship that has a Coastie as a captain. And this ship's going to have 52 officers and 650 enlisted men to give you kind of an idea of what they would, the capacity that they had. And the Hunter Liggins carried what were called Higgins boats. Do you know what that is?
I think so.
The little transport ships, if you think like Saving Private Ryan.
Yes.
So it's going to be transporting those, right? So that's going to be very important in the war effort, is getting those troops from the ship to the land. So that's what they're going to be doing. So during this time, they're finding, again, we need coxswains, which are the boat drivers, to be able to operate these little landing crafts and get these troops to shore. The Navy trains in mainly big vessel operations. The Coasties were perfectly suited for this. So they end up volunteering. Douglas and Ray both volunteer to learn how to operate these Higgins boats. And they said Doug was just a natural. He became the best Higgins boats driver out there, right? He was described by many as the best coxswain in the U.S. Coast Guard. And then these Coast Guard guys, they ended up training other sailors, Navy sailors, how to use these because they were so good at steering these crafts because they're used to harbors and they're used to small crafts and they're used to search and rescue things. So they're perfectly suited for this kind of stuff, where this is the big Navy necessarily might not be, right? They ended up transferring to the USS Dickman, and then they continued their hard work and were transferred to the USS Leonard Wood. So they're going from ship to ship to ship. While they're on the Leonard Wood, they ended up becoming part of a mission where they were transporting U.S. troops to India, which is another forgotten theater, the CBI theater. Yeah. And they were on that ship on December 7th, 1941. So they were rounding the Cape of Good Hope when they heard word that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. So for the last several years, they've been training for this, and now it's finally going to be real, right? So when they got to India, when they're dropping all these troops off, they're hearing all this news and they're hearing it over the radio, and security's extremely tightened, and these soldiers are getting off the ship and things are serious now. So we've talked about Pearl Harbor a number of times, but if just to put it back into perspective, Pearl Harbor, the Japanese destroyed a huge portion of our Pacific fleet, right? Yeah. Navy, thousands of sailors especially, but Marines, airmen, coasties as well, were killed during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Not only was the death count so high, they literally knocked us out, though. They knocked out our ability to make war, essentially, over there. It changed the whole way we had to fight this war. So we've had war on the horizon, and we've been trying to prepare for it, and then we just got a knockout blow, right? It's like Jose Aldo and Conor McGregor? You're training, and then you catch one, and then it's over, right? Yeah. That's almost where we were at. We were hit so hard, and it was so hard to recover. And then immediately after Pearl Harbor, Wake Island falls. The Philippines fall a short time later. The Japanese are continuing to bomb Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, Shanghai. Things are not looking good. We don't have a lot to fight back with. And then several days later, Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. as well, right? Our army was smaller than Romania's army when the war started. So as big of a country as we are, sometimes it's hard to understand how small our military was. So we didn't have much to push forward with. So this is a very, very, very scary time. As this was going on, we're trying to develop our war plans and figure out what we're going to do. The Japanese were creeping closer and closer to Australia. So our mission became, in the Pacific, we're going to try to stop the Japanese before they get to Australia. And we were going to focus our efforts on taking Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, and that was going to be our first major ground offensive. So any Marines listening, or if you've seen the Pacific, Guadalcanal's huge. Guadalcanal is this months-long battle. This is going to be our first major offensive. This is going to be our first at-bat where we're trying to attack the Japanese and push them back. The Solomon Islands were miserable, though. The Solomon Islands is the exact hell that you can think of in the Pacific. It was an archipelago, which is a bunch of tiny little islands, and there was mountainous on the large ones, heavily forested volcanic islands, 6 major islands surrounding it, and thousands of smaller ones. It was Guadalcanal was the largest island in the Solomons at 5,000 square miles, but this is just miserable jungle. When you think of like Vietnam, think of that with a darker jungle, right? Just World War II technology and World War II equipment and the herringbone twill fatigues and everything, but you're just constantly in the mud, constantly getting malaria, very little food, very little supply land, and the Japanese are everywhere, and they're dug in. Mosquitoes, malaria, dengue, and jungle fever. This is what they're
already there.
So they're going to be sailing to that. So they're going to end up sailing to Wellington, New Zealand to prepare. So we're using Australia and New Zealand as our bases to get ready for this attack. And while they were in New Zealand, they're seeing more and more ships. They're seeing how huge this operation is.
Yeah.
And Douglas is going to take this time very seriously. For the first time, he and Ray are going to be separated because Ray's going to be assigned to another ship, and they're going to be continuing their craft activities, right?
Right.
So they're going to be doing rehearsal landings, and by all accounts, Douglas was taking this extremely serious, right? He'd be the first one out there and the last one back. He's trying to come up with every problem that they may have and figure it out. And he quickly became known for his skill and discipline. When other coxswains had questions, everyone would say, go ask Munro, right? So anytime he developed a reputation as a guy who took his job seriously and he knew what he was doing. If something's wrong with your equipment or, hey, how do we do this? Just go ask Munro. So you'll see the pictures of him. He's a young-looking kid, a young, sinewy, skinny guy, but he was considered the best small boat operator on the island. And he actually ended up spending a lot of time with the Marines. He would eat with the Marines, and he would be seeing how they were, and he came to respect them greatly. When they actually would finally start the operations, that would come into play too, kind of his loyalty to the Marines. So I mentioned before that he did the signal flags and everything. So he's now cross-trained as a coxswain. He can drive, and he's also a signalman. So for the Battle of Tulagi, he was actually ordered to ferry the troops ashore, the Marines, and then jump off with them and go inland with them, which is not something you think of the Coast Guard doing as well, right? So he was ordered to ferry troops for the third attack wave and then beach his boat and attach himself to the Marine unit, which is just crazy to me. So as they're approaching, as they're preparing for combat, by all accounts, again, Douglas has no fear, but he's taking this very deadly serious. And on August 1st, 1942, he's going to be up early preparing his ship to get ready to go to battle. As they load, the Armada is speeding towards their predestined landing location, and they're going to be landing 15,000 Marines, right, to push forward and attack these Japanese the first time that we're going to actually be able to fight these Japanese. So the first waves of Marines are going to encounter heavy resistance as soon as they're landing, and Doug's going to be making repeated trip, dropping these guys off. And then on the third wave, he does just like I said. They speed up to shore, drop their ramps, the Marines get off, and then he's going to grab his signal flares, his signal lantern and his flags, and he's going to go off into the bush with these
no
Marines.
Gun?
He's not going to have a weapon because he's going to be using this other stuff, right? So they ended up not encountering any heavy resistance, but they're going to push forward. And then when they bedded down for the night, the Marines moved in rapidly, but they couldn't stop the Japanese. So he ends up being stuck on this island with the Marines, essentially. And he's out there, and the Marines are trying to protect him. Meanwhile, during the night, the Japanese are making counterattacks, and they're pushing back. So Douglas is out there with these Marines, with his flag and his signal lantern. And the Marines are trying to protect him, and they're telling him, make sure you stay down, don't expose yourself. But the way they would use these signal lamps was the Marines on shore to communicate with the Marines at sea, they would use the signal lanterns. So Douglas is ignoring their request, and he's ignoring his own personal safety, and he's climbing up on rocks, and he's using these lights. Think of what target that would be, right, if you're the Japanese. But he's got courage, and he's got grit. So he's up on these rocks, and he's signaling back. So he's doing this throughout the night, and the Marines know it's dangerous, so they're trying to protect him. So every time he gets up there with the lantern, they'll just start shooting into the bushes just to make sure no Japanese are there, just to hopefully protect him. So think of how tense that was. And it ended up, when the sunlight came up, they ended up finding multiple dead Japanese that were in the bushes right around them that had been trying to creep up, but they were able to flush them out.
That's crazy.
So as the sun came up, Doug ended up getting back on his landing craft and transporting casualties back. So just think of the intensity for, a guy in your early 20s. You're landing Marines in a combat operation. You're spending the night out there. Now you're taking all the wounded back. You're loading up these wounded and dead that could essentially be you or could be your friends, and then they're going back. When he gets back to the loading area, they saw that there were just, supplies everywhere. Think of the size of this massive operation. Think of like the LA Harbor and stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's what's going on. All this gear and everything were going to be there. And Doug's going to be a part of this as well. So just this massive hub of men, machines, and equipment. While they're there, they're going to be the Marines and the Coast Guard and everybody that's going to be in the Solomons. They're going to be watching the Battle of Savo Island, which is this huge 32-minute battle where the Japanese Navy sunk 4 of our heavy cruisers and heavily damaged many other ships. So they're going to be watching from shore, and they're going to be seeing. Think of the magnitude of a battle.
Yeah.
4 of our major ships were sunk, and then
ships?
I'm sorry.
Big?
Huge ships, yeah, huge ships. Our heavy cruisers. That's as big as you get when you see the big old Navy movies. Heavy cruisers. So because of this, there's going to be thousands of oil and blood-covered sailors clinging to life floating around in the water. So whose job is that?
Yeah.
That's going to be Douglas, right? So Munro and the other boats are going to immediately go out, and they're going to be trying to rescue these guys. The waters were so bad that sharks were eating these bodies. So Marines were up on the deck shooting their rifles at the sharks while these coasties were trying to pick up all these bodies. Thousands of these guys, right? So just think of the hell and think of the landscape. Think of what you're experiencing when 5 years before you were in high school or college,
Yeah.
right? And now you're in the South Pacific in these places that you never.
How are they
thought you would
sinking
be.
the ships with planes?
No, with other ships. This was a huge naval battle where
yeah.
these Navy guns, those big deck guns you're seeing, are pounding directly into it. They called it a barroom brawl with the lights out. It was so close that they were just hurling these shells into there. My great uncle was there.
Damn.
Yeah, he earned a Navy Cross in that battle, actually.
Wow.
But Max Archibald. But this is part of what all these guys are going to be experiencing. Munro and Evans were going to end up being reunited, and they were assigned to a boat pool on Cactus, which is the code name for Guadalcanal. So they're going to meet back up, and they're going to be in this area where all these crafts are stationed. Naval operating base Cactus at Lunga Point is where they're going to be, and that's going to actually be headed by a Coast Guardsman as well, which is going to be somewhat unique.
Yeah.
Commander Dwight Dexter was the Coast Guard captain. That's going to be the only known instance of a naval operating base led by a Coast Guardsman. But what this is this is going to be where all the equipment's going to be coming in and out. This is where all the the landing craft is going to be stationed.
So did we end up winning that battle?
Eventually, yeah.
The one that the ships were sunk. So we were sinking them too.
Well, it was back and forth, right? The sailors in the Navy actually lost more sailors to combat in the Battle of the Solomon Islands than Marines did on Guadalcanal, which is something that a lot of people don't realize. It was huge at that point in the war. Again, this isn't like points in the war later where it was Japanese are cut off on an island and we're just killing them until they're all dead.
Yeah.
This is their landing reinforcements. They're attacking us with planes. We're attacking them with planes. They're bombing us. We're cut off. We're starving. So this is a very, very, very different time. So it took several months, but eventually we won the naval and the land battle there. And that was our first victorious offensive. But it wasn't easy.
It took a month?
Months.
Damn.
Yeah, so on this naval operating base where they're at, though, Douglas and Ray, again, became kind of well-known because where the people are digging holes and living in them, Doug and Ray took all the boxes and they built a hut for themselves, so they had, like, windows and they had everything, so they were kind of well-known. They said they made a house from packing boxes and scrap material, and people described it as quite a swank establishment for Guadalcanal. One of the problems, though, like you mentioned with the Battle of Savo Island, their losses were so heavy, the Navy actually pulled back to New Guinea, leaving the Coast Guard and the Marines vulnerable. So they're out there without naval support, and the Japanese Navy is there, right? So we have nothing.
Jeez.
So all of a sudden, we have no equipment, we have no food, we have no protection. Rations were reduced to 2 a day for 6 weeks. So instead of 3 meals a day, they're only getting 2 meals a day, and those aren't good rations anyway. And you're also dealing with mosquitoes, mud, malaria, and the fear, right? Put it in the Marines' perspective, they're out in the jungle, they're out doing patrols, they're out digging holes and expecting those attacks at any time. The coxswains and these Navy crafts are going to be doing anti-sub patrols. They're going to be driving around. They're also going to be dropping off Marines here and there, so they're going to be a huge part of this combat. And Douglas ended up being in charge of all the boats. Unofficially, he was in charge of all these ships there because even the officers would come to him and they would ask him questions because he knew his job that well, right?
Right.
Even the Marines he had a reputation with the Marines because he was fearless and he would always help them and he would always do what he needed to and he was always in the thick of things. So he established a really good reputation. During this time, both Ray and Doug got malaria, which shows you kind of what the conditions were like. But eventually reinforcements finally arrived and Marines expanded the perimeter. They were able to push forward so we're no longer clinging on to life. And the Coast Guard was actually out there with them. So there was coasties out there stringing the barbed wire and digging the holes and manning those machine gun positions while the Marines were pushing forward and doing their job. But meanwhile, the Japanese were reinforcing their own positions. We don't control this area, so they're getting, which is rare later in the war. On Iwo Jima, there was no new Japanese coming, but on Guadalcanal, they were shifting. The war was very fluid at that point. In one incident with Douglas and Ray, on September 20th, 1942, at the Naval Operating Base Cactus, they received word that 2 downed American flyers were in a rubber boat between Savo Island and Cape Esperance, meaning they had been shot down. So there's word. So immediately Munro volunteers. Munro says, I'll go get them. So Munro, Ray, and a 4-man volunteer rescue team, they go out into the open sea basically to try to get these. And this becomes significant because there was actually a Marine War correspondent on the ship with them, or on the landing craft. So they went out into the darkness by themselves on this little landing craft. At 6:15, they spotted a rubber raft, but it was empty, right? So they know this is where these guys were, this is where these pilots were, but they're not in there anywhere. So the rescue team ended up following the current, thinking they must have gone ashore. And when they got there, they couldn't find any trace of the men, but they found 4 large Japanese landing boats that were anchored nearby. So that's like turning the corner and seeing a tiger, essentially, right?
Shit.
But they decided to press their luck, so they kept pushing in until they got in about 300 yards from the beach, and then the Japanese opened fire on these guys. They started opening up with machine guns. So Ray and Douglas started firing back while the coxswain was speeding out of there, you know. But just you can kind of picture these small boat operations while they're under fire. And Ray was actually hit in the leg by a ricocheting round. When they got back, the boat had been hit over 20 times by Japanese machine gun fire, but they survived.
Dang.
And it turns out that the crew had actually already been rescued by the time they went out there. So it was all kind of a fluke. But that just became important because that Marine War correspondent ended up writing about this, and his family was able to read that back home later. All right. On September 27th, 1942, Douglas was 22 years old, okay? Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, who any Marine who's worth his salt will know who that is, he's a legendary Marine, ordered the attack of 3 companies to attack the flank of the Japanese position on the west side of a river to take control of the western region of the island. So essentially, the Marines are planning an attack, right? We're trying to push forward on one side. There was some miscommunication, which we don't need to get into here, but we need to go, and we're going to send these reinforcements. So Douglas is going to be a part of this. Conditions were rough. There's heavy mud and difficult visibility once these Marines get ashore. But we have to get them ashore first. So Douglas was going to be placed in charge of these landing craft and 2 landing craft tanks and 8 Higgins boats to transport these Marines in. Of course, that's his job, so these guys are going to prepare to do it. Douglas and Ray spend their morning prepping their crafts, and at 12:30, they're going to embark, and these 10 landing craft and all these Marines are going to push forward. Their job is to drop these Marines off and essentially go back to the landing point, which they've been doing repeatedly, right? Each of these crafts, just to give you an idea, they have 30 cal machine guns for protection. So they have 2 guns up front. They're fairly small, but these are like, if you ever seen those videos in like Louisiana, those little skiff boats, they're like plywood boats, right? They're not very heavily protected, but that's what they're going to have. So Doug's boat's going to be in the lead, and they're going to rendezvous offshore with Navy destroyers, and these Navy destroyers are going to be trying to pound the shore before they go in. While they were doing that, the Japanese bombers actually flew over and attacked our ships, so our ships had to pull back out and try to fight off these Japanese planes, so they're going to be left on their own, these coasties and the Marines. So they're going to go in. Douglas is going to lead this crew. Again, 22 years old. Imagine how many men's lives are in his hands. But they're going to do just what they're supposed to. So they're going to be steering in, and they're going to see their landing position. But before they get there, they're going to realize that there's coral reef that's blocking their way. So Douglas is going to have to make a quick decision, right? He's going to have to find an alternate landing spot on the beach. So as they're speeding towards in combat, right, there's Japanese planes flying over, there's Navy big guns firing, they're going forward, but Douglas has the skill to realize we can't make it over this coral reef, so we're going to divert. So they actually found a stretch of beach surrounded by jungle that was a little up the way. So he's going to go up, and they're going to drop all these Marines off like they're supposed to. As soon as they pull out, Ray and another Navy coxswain are going to stay there and wait for initial wounded, and Doug's going to head back all the way to base because he's in charge of this operation, so he needs to get back to Cactus. What the Coast Guardsmen and the Marines didn't know was the Japanese knew that they were going to have to attack there. So they've already prepped this area. So they're essentially walking into an ambush, right?
Damn.
So they're essentially walking in. The Japanese know the Marines are coming, and they know where they're coming. So they just walked into a trap. They walked into a cave full of enemy, essentially.
Yeah.
So after successfully landing the Marines, Munro and most of the landing craft returned towards the sea. Evans and the Navy coxswain Roberts ended up remaining offshore. While they were there, the Japanese opened up fire on all these Marines and these Coast Guardsmen that were out there. So these Evans and Roberts, who were in their landing craft, started taking fire. And Roberts was actually hit as the machine gun ripped through the boat. It severely injured Roberts and damaged the throttle cable. So Ray had to jump over while his friend's wounded there and try to steer that boat back to shore. So he ends up making it back to the rendezvous point, and he pulls in, and the craft had been damaged so heavily that he had to just beach it onto the shore. So Evans is yelling, Roberts is hit. So Douglas jumps in the boat, and they're holding their friend there, right, who's been shot, and he's bleeding to death, essentially. So they're covered with his blood, and he ended up dying of his wounds later. He was transported by plane, but he ended up not making it. So Doug had ran to help him. This mission that you thought was going well, right? We just dropped these guys off. We improvised. We solved a problem, and now their friend is dead.
Damn.
Meanwhile, what they don't realize is that the Marines had pushed inland, and as they pushed inland, the Japanese waited for them, and then they cut them off. They got behind them. The Marine commander was killed by a mortar round, and now the Japanese were popping out of spider holes. They're firing at their backs. They're cutting them off. The Japanese had allowed them to get 500 yards inland before they opened up on them with mortar, artillery, and small arms, and now their commander's dead. So these Marines are in a desperate, desperate situation, right? The Marines tried to fight through, but they were cut off from the main force, and they desperately needed to be evacuated. But they had no radio, and they had no signalman, and they had no Douglas Munro there with anything, right? The Japanese were fighting them with interlocking fields of fire. The Marines couldn't see where the fire was coming from. They're just getting cut down, but they had nothing to communicate. When you think of Marines, what do you think of? Usually tough, right? Just hardened battle guys. These Marines were so desperate, they actually took their shirts off. They had white undershirts, and they spelled help on a ridgeline out of T-shirts, right? Think about how bad the situation has to be for Marines, combat World War II Marines, to be begging for help so bad that they took their white T-shirts off and they spelled help on the side of a ridge because they were getting cut to pieces and they had nowhere to go and they had nothing to do. A Marine dive bomber actually saw this and took word back to position. Back on Lunga Point, Douglas and Ray had just left the body of their fallen friend, right? They're covered in his blood and they're walking up the deck to go see what's going on, to go back to their duty station, to go back to do whatever, and they immediately see the commander, Dexter, running towards them, right? And he's yelling, "We need someone to help these Marines. These Marines are desperate. They need help. They need to get off there." Think about Douglas and Munro. Think about what that would be like if you had just experienced that. They just saw someone die. They just dropped off all these people. You know, that was their friend that was killed too. But if these Marines aren't protected, it's going to be a Custer's last stand situation. They're going to be decimated. They're going to be cut to pieces. Because Doug was the unofficial in charge, Dexter asked him, he said, "Are you willing and can you lead a rescue force to get these Marines off the beach?" And Douglas's response was, "Hell yeah, I got them in and I'll get them out." So Doug and Ray immediately turn around, running back down the pier, and they're yelling at everybody, "Mount up, get your ships, let's go," or "Get your crafts, let's go, let's go, let's go," right? Because now his only goal is to rescue these Marines. They just lost their friend, but these 500 Marines who are trapped need to be rescued, so they're going to do everything they can. So they're going to jump in their small craft, they're going to rev those engines, and they're immediately going to head back out to sea. The only difference is
back
before...
toward the machine gun.
Exactly. Before it was heading into an attack, now it's heading into a death trap where there's mortars, machine guns, they know you're coming, and they're luring you into a trap. But that's not going to stop Doug, and that's not going to stop these other guys with their little boats with 30 cal machine guns and plywood holes, essentially, right? They have very little protection, but they're going to be driving directly into the mouth of Japanese. So as they get close, the Navy destroyers are going to be giving them fire, and they're actually going to fire so much on the island that it's going to clear a spot for the Marines to retreat. So the Marines are retreating under the cover of American fire while Douglas and these other guys are streaming in towards the shore. As they got close, Munro and Evans are leading this flotilla. As they're getting close, the Japanese start opening up fire on the landing craft. You can picture these little craft going forward, and there's mortar rounds hitting around them. There's going to be water spewing up into the sea. There's going to be machine gun rounds hitting them. One of the other landing craft with another coxswain sped next to Douglas's craft, and he said, "We need to turn back. The fire's too intense. We're not going to make it. We can't help them if we're going to die." And they said, Douglas pointed towards the shore, and he said, "We're not leaving them. We're going in." He pointed towards, and he continued to go. So these other craft had no choice but to follow him, right? 22-year-old kid. So while they're under fire, Douglas gets close enough that they end up getting these craft to shore, so that he leads them in waves, and Douglas takes his craft and he steers it directly in between the mouth of the Japanese enemy and where the other crafts are going to be. So Douglas is steering and firing his 30 cal machine gun. Douglas and Ray are giving covering fire to allow these Marines to retreat, and the Marines come streaming back towards the beach, right? Imagine these Marines, they took their shirts off to scream help, and now you're seeing these handful of Coast Guardsmen, these 8 to 10 craft that are screaming up there. Munro's leading them in, and these Japanese are going to be following. They're going to be chasing, and the Marines are fighting, and they're dragging their own guys back. Meanwhile, Munro and Ray and these other guys are firing their 30 cal machine guns and yelling, "Come on, come on." One of the Marines was reported, when he grabbed the side of the ship, he had tears in his eyes. He was crying, and he said, "You came back. Thank God you came back," right? Because they thought they were done for. And now you're seeing these kids in these blue khaki shirts and these sailor hats, and they're firing. Just Again, think about being one of those Marines. You have to make peace with your mortality, and then all of a sudden the cavalry's arriving. But it's a cavalry in plywood boats and very little protection, right?
Just balls.
Because of these Coast Guardsmen and these sailors' actions that are there, all of the Marines, including the dead and wounded, actually managed to escape and get back to the craft. And that's including John Basilone. For those of you Marines who know, he was a Medal of Honor and a Navy Cross recipient. He was one of these men that would have been killed if it wasn't for Douglas's actions. So as they load up, Munro and the others are going to be laying down this fire with these machine guns, and they're going to continue to put down lead. This is the only cover they have. There's no protection for these Marines other than these coasties and these occasional sailors with these 30 caliber machine gun. But Doug has placed his craft directly in the line of fire. So if anybody's going to get killed, it's going to be him, right? If anybody's going to get killed, it's not going to be those Marines who are fighting so valiantly. It's going to be these guys because he said he dropped them off, so he's going to get them back. So Munro continued to fire his machine gun in the face of certain death, essentially. He's out in the middle and he's a target in order to protect these Marines. As long as he's there, they're going to have time to withdraw. So the firing's actually getting more intense, though, because as the Marines are getting on the ship, there's left of them firing. So the Japanese are literally coming at them, right?
Yeah.
Munro's remaining at his position, and Ray's firing, and all these other guys are firing. And eventually they get all 500 Marines on, and they start to pull away. The extraction was more successful than anybody could have ever imagined, right? So as they load up and they begin to pull away, Munro starts to drive back and lead these troops out, but he turns back and he sees that one of the LTCs was actually stuck on a sandbar or a reef. It was too heavy because it had these too many Marines in it. And the Marines are so desperate, they're jumping out and floating in the water and trying to rock it off and trying to raise the level. So Douglas immediately turns his ship back around, puts his craft in front, again, in between the enemy and this craft, and they throw it a line, and they're trying to get this craft free while they're laying down fire, while these guys are protecting them. And these Marines are desperate, and these sailors are desperate. And eventually, they were able to break free, and they were able to pull away. So again, Douglas got in front, and he started to steer his craft. This victorious flotilla is going to be steering back to Lunga Point. As they started to pull away, and as they finally got that craft free, Ray looked back, and he saw Douglas steering the ship, steering that craft. And Ray looked, and he saw machine gun spouts coming across the water. He saw the machine gun getting closer and closer. And Ray screamed to his friend. He said, "Doug, get down." But Doug couldn't hear him over the sound of the crafts and the sound of everything else that was going on. So Ray had to watch as Douglas was shot in the base of the skull, right at the spine, and Douglas slumped to the floor unconscious. So Ray immediately jumped in and took over, and Ray was able to speed the flotilla back, and he was able to get them back to Lunga Point with all these other craft following. As soon as he got there, Ray dropped down and held Douglas in his arms, and he said Douglas regained consciousness, and for a brief moment he was able to speak after being shot in the back of the spine, right? And he said, as Douglas was laying there, he didn't ask for help like a lot of these guys. He didn't ask, tell me I'm okay. He didn't ask any of that. His final words were, "Did we get them off?" Or "Did they get off?" Meaning, did we get the Marines? According to Ray, Munro, after he asked that, he said, "Seeing my affirmative nod, he smiled with that smile I knew and liked so well, and then he was gone." So Ray slumped down with Doug covered in Doug's blood, holding his friend, and he had just held his other friend hours before, right? So this is his second friend, and with blood and tears streaming down his eyes until the corpsmen came and they took Douglas's body away from him and carried him off. Douglas was 2 weeks shy of turning 23 years old when he was killed in action on Guadalcanal. But unfortunately, he was able to save those 500 Marines. So the next day, he was actually buried because of the conditions. He was buried on Lunga Cemetery on Guadalcanal, and his grave marker was actually a wooden cross, which had been constructed by his friend Ray Evans. So
nice.
I thought that was kind of a cool touch. A little bit of after story on this. I know we're short on time, but as we talked about before, this is the Coast Guard's only Medal of Honor recipient, right? And this is why I said some of the Marines are familiar with him. Chesty Puller himself, who you'll learn about maybe later, was actually the one that recommended Douglas to be recommended for the Medal of Honor, and that was passed through, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor. And in my opinion, Ray should be as well. I didn't get in too much about Ray, but I think Ray, it should have been 2 Medal of Honor.
He was right there with him,
right. But back home, it takes time for word to get back, right? So on October 15th, 1942, Munro's family's at home, and they read that account I was talking about how Douglas and them, they were trying to get these airmen, and they were reading this, and then they're hearing, "Oh, Douglas is okay," we're hearing this news, and then 4 days later, on October 19th, 2 Navy officers and a Coast Guard officer ended up knocking on the door to tell them, that their son had died, and they said his mom saw them and refused to answer the door, so she retreated into the house, and Douglas's dad had to come down and hold her, and then together they answered the door, and the sailors and the Coast Guardsmen told them that Doug had died, but they said, Because of his actions, he had saved 500 Marines. And the next day, they received a letter from the correspondent from Commander Dexter, which I'm going to read briefly.
Yeah.
He said, on Sunday, the 27th of September, an expedition was sent into an area where trouble was to be expected. Douglas was in charge of 10 boats, which took the men down. In the latter part of the afternoon, the situation had not developed as it had been anticipated, and in order to save the expedition, it became necessary to send the boats back to evacuate. Volunteers were called for, and in the highest traditions of the Coast Guard and also the traditions with which you had imbued your son, he was among the first to volunteer, and he was placed in charge of the detail. The evacuation was as successful as could be hoped for under fire, but as always happens, the last men on the beach are the hardest pressed because they have been acting as covering agent for the withdrawal of the other men. Your son, knowing this, so placed himself and his boats so that he could act as a covering agent for the last man, and by his actions and successful maneuvers, he brought back a far greater number of men than had been hoped for. He received his wound just as the last men were getting in the boats and clearing the beach. Upon regaining consciousness, his only question was, did they get off? And so died with a smile on his face and the full knowledge that he had successfully accomplished a dangerous mission. So that kind of sums him up right there, too, right? Those last words.
It's one of those things where you're terribly sad and heartbroken,
Right.
but at the same time, you probably got the most proud.
You can't not be proud of that,
Oh, my
right? Your son
gosh.
died, and his mother, actually, at 48 years old, to honor her son, she enlisted in the Coast Guard and attended
way.
basic training. And I know we're real short on time with there, but one of my favorite parts of this story was actually after the war, they ended up dedicating, an area in the cemetery for him where he was buried, and they put two, I'm going to say cannon, that's probably the wrong term, and they had a flagpole and everything. When Douglas's friend, Mike Cooley, his childhood friend, if you remember, we talked about him before, came home from the Army and he went to visit Douglas's gravestone, he saw that it was beautiful, but he looked up and the flag was tattered and there was no light on it. So he decided he was going to make it his mission to personally raise and lower a flag every day. So he went home and he would walk 3 miles there and 3 miles back every day. So he would put up the flag and lower the flag to show respect to his friend that had gone. And he ended up doing this 6 miles every day round trip for 40 years every day. He would walk 3 miles there and he would walk back. He continued until he was in his 80s. When he was an 80-year-old man, he was walking 3 miles there and 3 miles back.
That's
At one
amazing.
point, he got pneumonia. So instead of staying home and resting, he would call one of his daughters to come pick him up so she could drive him there so he could raise the flag and lower it. In 1998, he was suffering ill health, and he knew he was probably going to die soon. And he was worried that no one was going to be able to take care of his buddy's gravestone anymore.
Yeah.
So he actually called the Coast Guard, and he said, this is the deal. I'm an old man. I can't do this anymore. Would you guys be able to help, put in a light or do whatever? And they said, how long have you been doing this for?
Yeah.
And he said 40 years. So the Coast Guard
Holy
jumped into
shit.
action, and they gave him an awesome cemetery or ceremony there with a well-suited flagpole and everything else and took it over. But it kind of shows you the inspiration that one man can have to someone like Ray and to someone like Mike and to his mother and all those other things.
Man.
But we're real tight on time.
That's amazing.
But that's the story of Douglas Munro, the Coast Guard's only Medal of Honor recipient. And he has a number of awards, number of ships named after him, a number of other things. But one of the other things that's interesting is the only non-Marine in the National Museum of the Marine Corps' Wall of Heroes. So any Marines out there, next time you're talking crap about the Coast Guard, think about guys like Douglas Munro, Ray Evans, and everybody else that was landing all those crafts on all those beaches throughout the war.
That's awesome. I had no idea.
Yeah, so...
Good story, man.
All right, that's the story of Douglas Munro. Real short on time. We're about to cut off here. Sorry, guys. But thanks for listening. Comments, suggestions, anything else like that, and we'll get back to you.
Thanks so much.
All right.